targets of opportunity because there is a very extensive regulatory process. There are multiple permits and approvals that are needed, and so it's a kind of a target of convenience for those in the opposition. It is called on pipeline companies really to up their game, and up their game in two respects. The first has to do with stakeholder outreach, where I think these pipeline projects are now looked at as the equivalent of a political campaign. You've got to get out there early. You've got to get out there with the messages. You've got to identify your supporters. You've got to touch every base. You've got to be persistent about it, and I think that's the real game of pipeline companies. The other aspect of this is that because of that regulatory process, and the fact that in that regulatory process there is the ability to take it to court and litigate, the pipeline applications and the quality of the review provided by the FERC and the other agencies has really got to be bulletproof, because the activists have taken a very aggressive litigation stance in terms of challenging these pipeline projects. Well, pipelines make it possible is the tagline that Inga adopted a couple of years ago. And the point here is that if you think about the benefits of the shale revolution and bringing those benefits downstream to consumers and the economy, pipelines are the conduit that make that possible. Pipelines, as I said at the outset, have facilitated the most vibrant, competitive natural gas market in the world. They have made it possible for the U.S. to benefit very quickly from the shale revolution. Affordable energy in the form of shale gas has been a contributor to our economic recovery, and certainly has given the U.S. a leg up on its global competitors. The process works. Since 2000, the FERC has approved almost 17,000 miles of new interstate gas pipelines. FERC has approved over 1,000 miles in the past year and a half. And the demand for this infrastructure continues. Since the beginning of 2015, the FERC has received 43 applications for major pipelines. So the demand for the pipeline capacity continues. So as I said, and I think this kind of picks up on Bill's theme with the QER and their choice to focus on transmission infrastructure first, that it's pipelines and this transmission infrastructure for energy that really make it possible for us to benefit from our domestic energy resources. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tom. That was a really good overview. Maybe there will be a pipeline movie. Maybe there is enough in there. So. Bring up our last presenter, John Schmitter. John Schmitter is a recognized expert in economic and management consulting with over 30 years of experience in the transportation industry. He's currently a transportation consultant, economic management consulting, and president at KEP LLC. So, John, it's all yours.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning. I guess when you talk about energy structure, infrastructure, the railroad guy, I guess, always gets to go last. But when you talk about electricity, molecules moves through wires and gas moves through the pipelines. The railroad's big locomotives. You can actually see it, and it's it's fun. People get excited about it. The industry has a lot of rail fans that take pictures and do my beginning of my career. I started as a railroad operating officer at Conrail, and you forever had to watch out for these people who were standing there, taking pictures, not necessarily paying attention and being in places where they shouldn't be. I want to, the railroad industry in North America is a bit different than what Bill and Don described for natural gas and for electricity. So I'm going to talk to you about rail capacity from the railroad's point of view, and try to give you some sense for how it works, how those decisions are made, and so forth. But I thought, since so many of you are folks at this conference who are out from outside of North America, I thought it would be useful to give you a brief 2-minute overview of 100 and some plus years of railroad history. In North America, you've got in the U.S. you've got basically four major rail carriers, two essentially regional duopolies with BNSF and UP in the west, CSX and Norfolk Southern in the east. There is another Class 1 railroad, the Kansas City Southern, KCS, just really operates in a small swath through the middle of the country. But they also own the largest railroad in Mexico, so they're able to provide service to both. In Canada, there are two railways, the CN and the CP. So, but I think to point out here that in many cases the regions have more than one rail carrier. Most rail served locations are captive to one railroad. So you essentially have a monopoly on most railroad shipments. It's either captive at the origin or destination or both. And this is very different than my understanding is in most part of the world. In most parts of the world. So you have seven what's known as Class 1 railroads, which are large railroads. They are private companies. By private companies, I'm saying here they're publicly traded corporations, with the exception of BNSF, which is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, which is itself a publicly traded company. So they own the rail track, they own the locomotives. The people that run the trains work for those companies. Rail customers are involved in. The railroads own some of the rail cars that move commodities. The shippers that actually use the railroad customers own a fair number of the cars as well. So this industry is not, as in both parts of the world, is not about the government and the government provided infrastructure. There's very light economic regulation for so in the U.S. the Surface Transportation Board has some regulatory authority over it, but to make it clear, unlike FERC for pipelines, some rates are subject to regulation, but rates do not have to be published in tariffs. Railroad companies can do private contracts with whatever companies they want. Rates are market determined. In Canada, the Canadian Transportation Agency is also the nominal regulator of railroad transportation. Both of these agencies can regulate rail practices and some things that railroads do, but in Canada, rates themselves aren't even regulated. They have a process to challenge rates through final offer arbitration. In the U.S., you can also challenge a rate under certain circumstances if it's captive, and a few other things are true, but it's a very expensive and time-consuming process, and it isn't used very often. So what you have here in both of these countries are essentially lightly regulated, more or less capacity-constrained monopolies. From a business standpoint, it doesn't get any better than that. These companies are very profitable, and I would say whoever did the rating and gave the U.S. energy infrastructure a D, this would not be the case for rail assets. These are very profitable companies. Their stocks have outperformed the S&P 500 by a wide margin over the last 20 years. Rail infrastructure is in good shape. The companies have the capital to make the investments that are necessary. So I think all those things make the North American railroad industry a bit different than it is in the rest of the world. These are not poor companies scrambling for assets. capacity decisions are not dependent on government funding. They are not the result of government or political policy decisions. Private companies, these decisions are made. They are based on market signals. So what are the railroads handling in North America? The energy. Where does energy fit? Your energy commodities themselves are, may make about 25% of the carloads or units that the railroads handle. By far, the large majority of that is coal, and a lot was made about the growth of and the response that the railroads made, and Bill mentioned it when crude oil out of North Dakota and other rail locations needed a way to market, and there were no pipelines. The railroad responded, and in 2010 they handled virtually no crude oil, and by 2014 the companies were handling 1 million barrels a day, and it's about half of that now. But the railroads were able to respond. But a lot's made of it. But you can see that the bottom circle, crude oil, petroleum products make up a very small part of what the railroads handle. Your revenue is a little bit more distributed. Energy commodities make up a larger percentage of the revenue that the railroads earn than they do with carload commodities. But it's still relatively small piece of what the railroads do. They handle grain, they handle aggregates, sand, or one of my customers at the Southern Pacific described. He said, "You just handle various forms of dirt." But it's bulk commodities, and most of the movements, most of those commodities are captive to railroad. They're not necessarily captive to one railroad, but with the price of transportation, if the railroads weren't there, for example, all that Powder River Basin coal would still be in the ground. So some of these commodities move really only because there is rail transportation to move them. So what have you got here then? So with capital and capacity investment decisions being made, based on the market, the money comes from the cash flow that the railroads earn, just like it does for any company. And these are very, very capital intensive industries. It's for most railroads, it's just to keep the places running at the same level they are now. It's well over $1 billion a year for each of these companies. They spend 16, 17, 18% of their revenue in capital investment in railroads. So there are not that many industries that equal that. As with pipelines, any investment you make is fairly risky because just like a pipeline, when you put rail track in the ground, it's only used for rail for moving rail traffic in the place that it is. I mean, it can be lifted up and utilized elsewhere. And there is some of that going on now. But if you look at the cash flow, this is just in 2014, the railroads, 4 out of these 7 railroads, spent more money in capex on their properties than they did in providing that cash back to shareholders in the form of share buybacks and dividends. And if you listen to railroad quarterly conference calls with the Wall Street Analyst, they have a very tight leash on the management of these companies on spending capital dollars. And it's very, probably half of all the questions analysts ask are about capex. Is it too much? Wall Street wants them to grow. They want them to do it, to a certain extent. They have to invest in capacity to grow. But there's a lot of back and forth going on about how much capex is really justified. The analysts have several paranoias. One of them is that they will invest too much in capital investment in the railroad, and it will be, it will end up being wasted money because there's a decline in some significant business areas, and there's some of that going on now, with the really fundamental decline in coal shipments, that those are going down. A lot of that's not coming back. They're also paranoid about additional regulation that would constrain the railroad's pricing power, and they are concerned that they will be overinvested in capital and start competing with each other. That's the last thing that those guys want. So there's a lot of discussion. There's a very tight leash on how much these managements can spend on capital. So there's competition for the capital. Energy commodities also face competition from other commodities that the railroads handle. So where do they really stand in the railroad's overall profitability structure? So you can see here that if you just look at these major commodities, petroleum products, crude petroleum, ethanol, coal, are among the most profitable things that the railroads handle. So you look at from a priority standpoint, it's not like your local train master is sitting there with this chart deciding which to move first. But in general, if they need to make capital investments to handle energy commodities, the returns are high enough to justify that capital investment. Because you not only have to take what you've got as in terms of your whole book of business as a fixed level investment. You can look at one of the things as well. Do those capital dollars, those incremental capital dollars, does my least profitable business support that investment? No, it's not really about that. So you really have the ability to and they do this, and they have done it to price some of their least profitable traffic off of the railroad. And if you can ask anyone who was in the forest products business in 2005 or 2006, you can ask them what that was like to a certain extent. They went through the same thing in 2013. So there's been a grand bargain over time that the railroad's position has always been, if you give us the pricing power and the ability to earn what we feel is a good return on investment, we will make the capital investment in the property to provide you better, more consistent service. We'll hire train crews and so forth. And you can see on that the one graph, they essentially have done that. That capital investment has tracked profits. It's not out ahead of profits. These guys aren't making capital investments to handle the growth that they project in 2025. They're making capital investments to handle the growth they project in 2016. And in some cases, a lot of 2015 dollars were spent to handle business that materialized in 2014. So it's very much of a just-in-time issue. The same thing with hiring crews, buying locomotives, and so forth. So it being a just-in-time process, it's very difficult for them to cope with this unexpected increases in volume. I'm talking about a 5 or 6% increase in volume would be very difficult for them to respond to quickly. Just to hire crews and get them qualified in a reasonable level of productivity. 6 months. So, and locomotives, there's really only one locomotive manufacturer in North America that can produce a locomotive that can meet the emissions requirements 1 year. So, and to make capital investment in rail and technology for signals and so forth, even longer than that. So, there's been a lot of various times where the whole system has melted down, and people blame it on outside things, and most recently in 2013, 2014, it was a bad winter in Chicago. Now service went all to hell before that. It was in the fall as a result of Chicago weather didn't help, but it's a result of really volume exceeding the capacity that existed at the time. So there are periodic shortages. It's not like they have crews waiting around and locomotives sitting around waiting for the next surge in volume. And their regulators do not have the statutory authority to make them do that, like you would with an electric power company. Those decisions are totally made by the market now. So, some of them have a bit excess capacity now because volume has dropped off, and you can see that services got better as volume has dropped off. But it's temporary because what they're doing now is starting to pare back on operations and so forth to meet the level of volume. So customers are already seeing while the velocity of the system went up, they're already starting to taking train crews off, consolidating where trains used to run 5 days a week, now they're running 3, and both CSX and NS are making really permanent changes in their coal operations in the Central Appalachian area to look at reducing crew operations, eliminating locomotive servicing facilities, and so forth. This will impact the service for the traffic that remains. So a couple of takeaways for it. So I guess the bottom line, if you look at it, the railroads do have capacity to handle energy commodities. The commodities are profitable enough that they will make capital investment where they need to in the future, and they will adjust the capacity up and down to meet what they view as the projected demand. But since it's not something they can respond to very quickly, there will be periods of congestion and periods of good service depending on the fluctuations in volumes. They have a lot of market power. They will increase the rates as market conditions allow. So if you're a takeaway, if you're an actual shipper of these commodities or a physical trader of these commodities, you need to recognize that sufficient capacity might not be immediately available when it's required. What Bill referred to that happened in 2013 and 2014, where utility stockpiles started to decline and everybody was wringing their hands. That happened as a result. I mean, the railroad service did break down, but it also, they expected that, well, anytime we need to increase the inventory and increase the velocity, we're doing 2 trains a day, we can do 6 tomorrow, just order 6 tomorrow. It doesn't work that way. So if you're a trader in these commodities, you need to recognize that is not going to be, capacity may not be available when you immediately need it. Over time, they'll make the investment and get what you need. So I mean that requires a change or an understanding as you create inventory policies that you're going to be holding more inventory than you might otherwise want to. The service isn't good enough to be able to hold a minimum level of inventory. And it's not just for utilities. There's all the companies where rail is a significant piece of the supply chain need to do the same thing. And then the last I'll say this is, these companies don't have to be victims here. That how this works for you is very much dependent on how well you manage your railroad, how good a customer you are, and probably does anyone here actually make a rail shipment? It's not really a rail shipper crowd, but it's not just theoretically. How you manage. There is capacity need. Some companies do this better than others, and those companies get better results from the railroad. So it's very important if you're looking at these companies or you're an investor in one of them to understand how well they do that. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I mean, sometimes it is staggering to think that all of this stuff works when you kind of take a step back and all of the different physical structures and company structures and government. It is a little awe-inspiring sometimes that we have lights and electricity and everything when we need it. We are right on time. Our panelists did a great job of staying exactly in their time, so we have lots of time for questions. So if you would like to come up to the mic, introduce yourself, ask your question, and I'm sure it will be well answered.
Hi, I'm Peter Ballas from NETL. John, in particular, two questions. You mentioned market power by the Class 1 rails. Did they capture any economic rent when oil prices were $100 a barrel? Are they going to give any back? And secondly, was there any serious look by the rails at LNG fuel locomotives?
Is this on? So to answer your first question, they did capture a significant amount of economic rent when the prices were $100. They, maybe not as much as they could have because they were trying to encourage most of the capital investment when crude oil started with the railroads was made by companies other than the railroads. Midstream companies invested in the terminals to load crude oil on rail cars. They invested in terminals to unload crude oils, and they invested in the cars as well. So the railroads spent a lot of time, but as once that it became in place, those routes went up pretty substantially. Now some of them are starting to look at now that the price of oil is down to starting to reduce rates, but just as with coal, there's a real question about even if you gave it away for free, is it really going to cause more barrels to move? And I think the answer to that question is all just about no in just about every case. So they are sensitive. The people that make those decisions do know the industry pretty well and stay close to the customers. On the LNG locomotives, railroads are looking at that technology for locomotives. And it's
let me just add a point. I found John's presentation really fascinating and informative. A lot of stuff I wish we knew when we were doing the QBR. Where the heck were you? But for this crowd, I think it would be useful to explain why rail's so light-handedly regulated, which is basically what you showed the 7 Class 1s. That's basically the end of the story of Survivor. I mean, when the current regulations were put in place, the concern was, will we have any railroads left? And so they were given fairly light-handed regulations so they could figure out a way to survive. Do you agree with that? No,
that's correct. I do workshops for clients in various industries that are much longer than this, where we go into a bit more depth in the history. But when I started in the railroad business in 1977, there were 56 Class 1 railroads. There are 7 now, and so there's been a lot of consolidation. It was very heavily regulated, and really they couldn't even do things like pare back infrastructure. If a track was in place, it was a very onerous. Even though there was no demand for that infrastructure, it was a very onerous process at the time the Interstate Commerce Commission, just to reduce your infrastructure. So a lot of the railroads' return to profitability came from the cost side, not the revenue side.
Yes, I have questions for everybody, but Bill was wonderful because he basically asked the question that I had for John, so that was perfect. So I'll skip both of those two and go to Don. A question. Bill was talking about the need for essentially refurbishment of the infrastructure, in various places. As far as gas pipelines are concerned, I'm wondering to what extent these pipeline reversals and repurposing and so forth are essentially an opportunity for the industry to inspect very carefully and actually go through the process of kind of shoring up that system on the interstate level that we say is needed for a lot of these pipes that are 50 years old or more.
That's a good question. I think there are kind of multiple answers to it. First of all, when we're talking about the age of the infrastructure and the condition that it's in, as Bill mentioned, a lot of the remaining cast iron and bare steel pipe that's part of the gas infrastructure as part of the distribution systems, and particularly some of those distribution systems in some of the older eastern and midwestern cities. And there's a real emphasis on replacing that, both due to the pipeline safety driver and, as Bill said, the driver to reduce methane emissions. For the natural gas transmission pipelines, while a significant part of that infrastructure is older, it tends to be higher strength steel, and there is a program that is part of the Department of Transportation safety regulations called integrity management, that pipelines are required to inspect the pipe at regular intervals. The focus is on so-called high consequence areas. Those are areas that typically have got concentrations of population. However, given the nature of putting in these inline inspection devices, the so-called smart pigs, you typically put them in where there's a compressor station. You typically take them out where there's a compressor station. Those tend to be about 60 miles, 70 miles apart. And so as a result of that requirement to inspect the high consequence areas, in fact, the pipes have inspected probably about 70% of the mileage out there with the smart pigs. And that program has been going on since 2004. Also, as a result of the new pipeline safety legislation that was passed in 2011, and regulators are just getting around to doing safety rules for it, there is a big emphasis on pipe that was installed prior to the advent of federal pipeline safety regulation in 1970. And in particular, going back and making sure that you have got adequate records from when that pipe was constructed, like, what is the quality of the pipe, was it pressure tested, at what level, and if you don't have that, the requirement to go back and do that testing. And so that's going to be recurring. I think the other thing with the transmission pipes, it's really, I don't think age necessarily correlates to being unfit for service. I think the question is how well is it maintained? What is the environment that it's in? There are some cases where if you're in an environment that's highly corrosive, relatively new pipe could be at risk. Other cases where if it's in a benign environment, you can dig up old pipe and it looks attractively new. The last part of your question is interesting because you are right in that in several cases these pipeline reversals and revising the infrastructure to deal with the new flows are providing some opportunities to update the infrastructure. For example, Columbia Pipeline, which its legacy system was fortuitous to sit over a lot of Marcellus shale, recognized that they, in order to accommodate the new flows, they could also address a lot of their legacy pipe and replace it. And so they undertook a major program. They got a settlement with their customers approved by the FERC, and they're in the process of doing that. Another pipeline company, and one of their executives spoke in Washington yesterday, Spectrum, their Algonquin system, which is predominantly in New England, they've got some upgrades of that system there to deal with the conversions from oil heat and also to meet the electric generation load. And what they are doing is that they are taking the pipe that's on their existing rights of way, for example, they may have 30-inch pipe, and they're replacing it with 42-inch pipe and increasing the compression in order to increase the capacity of that system. So they're effectively modernizing their existing system as part of expanding the infrastructure. However, let's remember that all of this is driven by you have to comply with the safety rules, but also the customers have to be willing to pay for it. And so that's another important part of this thing, is to what degree is there the market driver to pay for it. And luckily, in the case of both that Columbia example and the Spectra example of Algonquin, there's the demand for the new capacity created by the growth in demand, the change in flows that have provided the economic support to be able to undertake those projects.
Thank you very much.
Let me put 2 cents in on that one too. One of the fascinating outcomes in the last couple of years with the crunch up in New England is that, and I forget if it was, I think it was last winter, but it might have been the winter before last. It's like the largest price differential on a geographic basis in the world was between Marcellus and New England. You had the highest price in the world in New England on a few days and the lowest price in Marcellus. And it's all due to the lack of infrastructure. And I mean, we're talking about versus Japan or Europe as well on LNG.
Next, please.
Hi, Denise Maserol, Princeton University. I have a question that perfectly follows up from this last discussion. One of the projects in my group is that we're going out to the Marcellus region in Pennsylvania and West Virginia and measuring methane leakage from abandoned oil and gas wells. We're finding a wide range of fluxes coming from those wells, but anecdotally, while we've been out in the field, we have a methane sensor with us, and we've come across transmission lines with large valves that we put our sensor up against and found that in this one particular case in Pennsylvania, it was at lower explosive limit concentrations right by the valve. And in West Virginia, we found a case where there had been a small landslide and a distribution pipe had broken and was hissing methane out again at lower explosive limit concentrations, which is where our sensor saturates. The fluxes we actually do with chambers, and it's much more complex than just the sensor. The sensor has uncertainties associated with it and whatnot. But so to follow up from your very interesting and comprehensive explanation for the last question, I'm just wondering what's being done for these areas that are sort of remote, where we see these leakages, but clearly they haven't come to the attention of the gas companies at a sufficient level to actually be addressed. Is there a system for handling these? Because it certainly seems that these leaks, which persist for long periods of time, could be, providing a lot of methane to the environment.
I can't speak to what the upstream sector is doing in terms of, abandoned wells and things of that nature. You're right, methane is receiving increased attention, both for distribution pipes and for transmission pipes. For transmission pipes, the evidence is that looking at this overall, the largest sources of methane emissions are pipeline compressor stations where you've got moving parts, so there's the ability for some leakage there. And then also when pipelines must blow down their systems, in other words, evacuate the gas from the pipe, either in order to perform maintenance or in some cases for safety reasons. The other thing that's interesting that your question kind of touches upon is that, as you probably know, there have been a number of studies done on methane leakage and where it's coming from. And one of them was done, and there have been a series of studies done with the Environmental Defense Fund, some academic institutions, and then industry collaborative. And one of the things that was discovered in the study that was done of transmission and storage was that in many cases the leaks and some of the significant leaks were due to, quite frankly, errors or kind of sloppiness in maintenance and operations. The fact that a valve hadn't been closed after somebody, hadn't been completely closed after somebody did routine maintenance on something or something of that nature. So I think that point, does highlight the fact that in many cases, a lot of this can be addressed, not so much via technology changes or things of that nature, but just quite frankly, better practices in terms of repair and maintenance of facilities.
Okay, last question. Great.
Patricia Van Horn, I'm a consultant from France, and I sort of it was intriguing to get this perspective because I didn't realize to what extent the different concepts of how infrastructure is used are really radically different between France and Europe. In particular, if you look at both gas and railroads, there was some discussion of rights of way, and there was the picture of all people yelling and screaming because we wanted to build a pipeline somewhere. And then in the discussion on railroads, I didn't hear any discussion at all about what happens if you want to build, lay new rails and put them through some new place, which may mean that we have enough capacity, there's enough existing rights of ways or old rights of ways to do that. And the other point that I think is very different, which is intriguing, is that one of the big issues in Europe is that railroads are not particularly useful for transporting energy because there's big priority, the existing railroad rights of ways almost always have priority given to passenger rail, which I think is, you know, in this context, not an issue at all. Nobody's using the same tracks for passenger rails, so I guess I'd just sort of leave that for comments from on both, you know, either Mr. Santa or Mr. Schmitter.
Well, I can address the rail portion. I mean, that is a significant difference between railroads in the U.S., especially railroads in Europe, and in the U.S. railroads are primarily handle freight transportation, and you know there is some sharing of joint, you know, the U.S. passenger National Passenger Network, Amtrak. Those trains do use the tracks of the freight railroads for a large part of their movements, but you know, but for the most part, I mean, there's very little of it percentage-wise, you know, that moves over freight railroads. You know, passenger transportation in the United States is about automobiles. You know, so, but as far as laying new rail track, there's very little new, you know, or the ability to, there's no new railroads are not common through areas that they don't have now. Railroads, right of way or private property, they own it. So when they need to expand capacity, generally the lines run where they're supposed to go to, but instead of one main track, go to second main track, and you know, can do other things, extend sidings that would increase the capacity of those lines, and they also can do the same thing with yards and terminals where cars are switched to stores. Is that it? Does that answer your question?
No, that's very interesting.
I guess the only thing I would add to it is that, you know, for the U.S. pipeline industry, we're fortunate that we've already got a very well-developed infrastructure, so I think that is a great benefit to us. And also, I think that the pipeline companies, to the extent that it's possible, are going to try to do projects using existing rights of way, just to, you know, minimize the level of opposition, to have less execution risk in doing the projects, to be able to do them more economically. And so I think there's a great premium on that. And then also we have been, you know, somewhat fortunate, and both Bill and I talked about it, that the infrastructure has proven to be probably more flexible than anybody would have guessed in terms of the ability to accommodate these reversals of flow, and even in kind of replumbing the infrastructure to accept the new flows. You can do so with relatively minor facilities rather than building a great big new one. And the final point, I think Bill kind of mentioned it, mentioned this in his presentation. Given how dramatically this market has changed, even for those who were, you know, in it and very, very astute, I think there's not a lot of appetite for taking the risk to develop major new long line pipelines because of how quickly things can change. You look at that Rockies Express project that was done back when people thought that the Rockies was going to be a domestic source of gas. You know, that one, and they know the shale revolution was coming, I don't think that ever would have been built. And then the final piece of this, and I didn't mention it, and that we're seeing here is that in some instances, underutilized gas pipeline capacity is being converted to carry crude oil and natural gas liquids, which is accommodating, you know, handling the liquids flows. I think the one thing to add there is that even if the economics drive that, you need to get permission from the federal regulator to do that. And a big issue is dealing with, even if the capacity is underutilized, how do you deal with those remaining customers on that facility to make sure that they're not left stranded?
I'll just drop one last thought because I'm kind of surprised it didn't come up. But so, I mean, don't forget in that remarkable flexibility, LNG. We were going to build 30 LNG import facilities, and now we're looking at a whole bunch of export facilities, and some of them are the same spots, of course, because you already have the toughest part, which is the site permitting.
Yeah. So thanks to our panelists. I think they did a great job of making this topic as sexy as possible. Please help me in thanking them. Enjoy the rest of the day.